folks, Chuck Holton here. Thanks for watching the Hot Zone. I've got Zack the Russian on with me again. If you have been watching the show, you saw the two-part series we did with him this couple months ago now. And Zack is in Georgia now. And I just wanted to get an update and see how things are going. So, Zack, tell me a little bit about, for people who didn't watch the first episode, introduce yourself and explain why you're in Georgia and what you're doing there, and then let's talk about that.
Yeah, sure. Hey, Chuck. Yeah, thank you so much for having me on your podcast, and hello, viewers. Yeah, my name is Zack. I'm 21 years old, from Russia. Left Russia March 3rd, 2022, once the war started, because I went to the protests, and then eventually this was dangerous to stay in Russia. So I left to Georgia, Tbilisi, and the only reason, to be honest, I left to Georgia, I mean, there are a couple of them, but the main one is because kind of like visa-free regime with Georgia. Actually, I think every foreigner, not citizens of Russia, you can come to Georgia for almost a year, like 364 days. Stay here unlimited, no limitations at all. Then you can just go for one day, make like a visa run, as it is called,
Yep.
for one day, come back, and you'll get another year. So basically, you can stay here forever. And Georgia is a cheap country. Most of the people, I would say most of the like mature old people, they speak English or they speak Russian, and also young people speak English. So I'm comfortable speaking both languages. That's also one of the reasons why I moved to Georgia. And it's pretty close to my friends who are still in Russia and who cannot leave. But if they just want to visit me, it's not like going to, let's say, Argentina. Because when I was living in Russia, one of the lists which I had is like South America. It's like funny, as Nazis after the Second World War we run into Argentina. It's I felt kind of like the same in a way. Yeah.
Well, I live in Panama full time, and it is very nice there for sure. But one of the reasons that I chose Panama is because it's close to the United States and it's easy to go back and forth and visit. Now that I have grandchildren, that's very important.
Sure.
So you came in March to Georgia. There are lots and lots and lots of Russians that
Yeah.
did the same, and also went to places like Armenia and Turkey and other places. What has your experience been like in Georgia with the people there? Are they friendly? Are they mad because there are so many Russians there, or what?
Mm. Yeah, Georgia, it is really important to understand the background of relationships between Russia and Georgia, because 20% of Georgia is occupied by Russia. There are two regions, which is Abkhazia, which is borders with Russia at the western northern part of Georgia, and also Ossetia. That's a region, how we call it in Russian, maybe in Georgian, it sounds different. And those regions are occupied by Russia, and it's basically 20% of Russia, of Georgia. And because of it, of course, there are tensions with Russians. Nobody wants to have occupants in their home country, and so many Russians came to Georgia just because it's close, and visa regime is pretty chill. And of course, yeah, there are some tensions, but I wouldn't say that there is Russophobia, as Russian propaganda used to, fear everyone with that. When I came in March, it was actually a really interesting experience, because every single taxi driver with whom I was riding with, they just felt like it's their duty when they hear that I'm from Russia, to ask my opinion on the war. And once I say, yes, I'm against the war, Slava Ukraini, they would be like, okay, you're my brother. If you need any help, just call me. And they even asked me for a barbecue with their families. So once in Georgia, you show your position, people really like, treat you well as any other person. Um, and yeah, in March, I would say also that in March, there are two waves of Russian immigrants. The first one is in March, April, once the war started. And those were the Russians, as we call intelligents, those who are, let's say, at least they can make money online. So those are the IT workers, software developers. Those are, bloggers, as myself. Those are the teachers of English who can teach remotely. I met so many of them here in Tbilisi. those are, different political activists. So those are the people who were first wave immigrants from Russia to Georgia. But then when the mobilization started, 21st of September, I remember this date as 24th of February, and so many of Russians fled to Georgia trying to escape mobilization. And oh my gosh, those Russians are, they are way different from the first wave of immigrants. Because I remember, like, just an example, I was hosting some of a Russian family with a cat. They literally, escaped, just a young couple, 27, 28 years old, and a cat in the back. And they told me the story how they were running from Russia and they were stuck at the border between Russia and Georgia for like 30 hours with a cat with a back inside, and they had to march with the cat for like 15 kilometers just to get closer to the border because there were news that Russia is going to close the borders at all. So people were trying to, it looked like some zombie apocalypse movie. So many people were trying just to get into small entrance to Georgia because those roads, that border between Russia and Georgia is really like mountainous. There are so many mountains, and the roads are really like how do you say, narrow. It was a disaster for, I think it's going to be remembered in the Russian history for a long time. And of course, this bloody war with Ukraine. And those Russians who came after the second wave, they are way different, I would say, because even that family that I hosted, they were thinking, okay, we will enter Georgia from Abkhazia region, and Abkhazia region is occupied by Russia, and it is impossible to enter Georgia from that region. And
It'd be
once
like
I
crossing the
called them,
front lines to get into Ukraine. That's,
yeah,
yeah, that's
it's
not a friendly border.
Yeah, right, right. So when they came, they were confused. Why didn't they are able to make it to Georgia from Abkhazia? And I was like, guys, have you heard about 2008 invasion of Russia to Georgia? And they were like, sorry, what do you mean? Like they never heard of it. And those were, the guy was like a marketologist, and the girl was like a teacher of English. So those are the people who are, working with the brain. They should be like more intelligent than, let's say, like the person who works at the factory for the most time and, doesn't really make intelligent labor. So even they didn't know about much of like Russian, let's say, invasions and just, how foreign policies. So those
So
Russians who started to,
I mean, that's just sort of a picture of how Russian propaganda is so pervasive inside Russia that you don't know anything about some of the things that Russia doesn't want you to know about. So, for example, when the invasion started here in Ukraine, many Russian soldiers came from the north, from Belarus, down through the Chernobyl exclusion zone, and they got held up there. And so these guys dug foxholes in the dead zone of Chernobyl, into the sand that was brought in and put over the radioactive dirt that's going to be radioactive for thousands of years. And they were not told anything about it. Those guys didn't know anything about the disaster that happened in 1986 in Chernobyl. And so as a result, there were like 8 busloads of Russian soldiers who died from acute radiation poisoning because they dug foxholes into that soil. And to this day, if you go to Chernobyl, those foxholes are there, and the radiation level is sky high because they uncovered all of that, and they were never told about anything like that. So it's fascinating look at the control that Russia has over what you see when you live in Russia and what you understand about that. We've learned a lot about that from guys here in Ukraine that tell us about during the Soviet times, what they were told about America, and the reality of America versus what they were told about America, two very different things. What we understood about Russia at that time, or about the Soviet Union, was not exactly correct, but was quite a bit closer to reality because we have a free press, and the free press
Mhm.
can say what it wants, right? So
Yeah.
that's fascinating to hear. Now, were those people as against the war as the first wave of people?
I would say, yeah, of course, they against war. Like at least those people whom I hosted, like I ended up hosting something about 4 families. And personally, I didn't know them. They were just friends of my friends of my friends. Some of the friends actually were whom I met in the US while my exchange program. And it was quite fascinating how, in the really hard times, people try to connect and to find at least some help from anyone. Yeah, they were against the war, but they just didn't know much. They were like, yes, we heard there is a war, but we try to not to read the news because it's depressing, it's hard, we do not understand. And there was also one guy whom I hosted. He was about 20, 24 or 23. And when we were discussing the war, he was like, yeah, the war is bad, but I don't really know. Maybe, some it's not that obvious who is wrong. I was like, no, man, it is freaking obvious. Russia invade, like, is the huge invasion, the first huge war in Europe since the Second World War, and Russia invades another country. No, man, it is obvious. And he was like, oh, maybe. So, those people who were fleeing Russia after, in the second wave of immigration, they are a bit different, with a bit different mentality. And it kind of a little bit wastes the, how would you say, the picture of Russian in Georgian mentality. And I start to see there are so many graffitis on the streets of Tbilisi. Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, it was like, "Oh, Russians, go home," or like, "Fuck Russians," or etc. etc. I mean, there were such graffitis before, but since mobilization, so many more.
You're
And
talking about
also,
graffiti on the walls, right?
yeah, graffiti on the walls, on the metro, just on the buildings. Yeah, Tbilisi is a pretty colorful city. There are many like murals, but also some of the graffitis, and there are many like Russia related and politics
Okay.
related right now. Yeah. Speaking of about how those Russians who fled mobilization, where do they live? What do they do? Well, basically, there is a city of Batumi. It's the city on the shore of the Black Sea.
Mhm.
It used to be a Russian speaking city. I mean, yeah, Georgians live there, but they just used to speak Russian more than Georgian language. And most of Russians who wants to be like out of that hate towards Russians, they just go to Batumi, and there they just feel like home, like Russia, basically, because everyone speaks Russian. It looks approximately the same, and they just go there. And also it's less, it's cheaper. It's cheaper, way cheaper than
Makes sense.
Tbilisi, because oh my gosh, since so many Russians came, the rent prices in Tbilisi, they went skyrocketing. Because as far as I've heard, 120,000 Russians came to Tbilisi after the mobilization, and I think approximately the same number came before mobilization, like since March up to September. So imagine, Tbilisi is not a huge city. It's like 1.3 million people living here. And once your city, the population grows by 15 or 10%,
Yeah,
of course, there's going to be problems with accommodation.
yeah,
So the
absolutely.
prices for rent, they went skyrocketing. For example, my friend Natasha, she's a holder of YouTube channel called Natasha's Adventure, previous year Russia. She came to Georgia before mobilization in like 5th of September, but she didn't want to find an apartment right away, so she was staying in a hotel. But then once mobilization, was called 21st of September, she started to look for apartments, and it appeared that the prices in one day doubled out. So the price, so for example, you could
Wow.
rent a one-bedroom apartment before in a really good neighborhood of Sabortalo for $500, but in the second day, like 22nd of September, it was $1,000. And right now it's about $1,300 for. And Georgia is kind of like it's a not the most wealthy country. The average salary
Yeah,
in Georgia
Georgia's
is
a pretty
about
cheap country, just like Armenia. And the same thing happened in Armenia. That's amazing. I mean, those kind of numbers, when you look at what the number of Russians who went to Armenia as well, you're talking about probably 1 million people between Georgia and Armenia, two tiny little countries,
yeah.
and the exact same things happening, rents going through the roof, prices going up. You can't swing a dead cat in Yerevan without hitting a Russian. And not that you would want to, but but and just fascinating that that doesn't include people who went to Turkey, that doesn't include people who went elsewhere. Um, and all of them are having to face the same kinds of questions now. Am I ever going to get to go home? Because well, what? Let me ask you this: your family back in Russia and friends back in Russia, when you talk to them, what are those conversations like now?
Oh yeah. Oh well, mostly. Yeah. Let's discuss firstly my family. Of course, I call my mom more often, and my mom is trying to avoid, the topic of the war. But all the time, I'm trying to bring it up because that's at least the only one thing I can do to change my mom's opinion about it. If I would just give up, I cannot change. I cannot change anything. And many of my friends, they also got their parents believe in propaganda or believe in some conspiracy theories, and they give up after some time trying to change their opinion. But if you give up, the chances that you can change their opinion about the war and to change at least something, they are zero.
Mhm.
But if you just try, there is, yeah, maybe there is like couple of percent, but those are at least something. And throughout this war, my mom changed the opinion about the war so many times. Oh my gosh. So she, at first point, she believed propaganda. Then I had a really long conversation with her, and then she started to question that propaganda. She started to be against the war, and then so she started to, just to read some. It's kind of like a meme in Russia that people over 40s they used to only use WhatsApp, and there are not much of a communities on WhatsApp, like videos. You can only send messages, forward messages to other people, and those forwarded messages with some propaganda statements, they are all over Russian WhatsApp. And usually like people who are over 40s, they are under that propaganda. I'm not being ageistic, that's like just how it works in Russia. And my mom, after those messages, she tends to believe not me, but more of her friend from her work sent her forward her some message, which is, in my opinion, is being sent directly from FSB or somewhere. Just yeah, I'm
Hey,
not
your
joking.
family's from the Western, or I'm sorry, from Eastern Russia, right? You came from the East.
Yeah, yeah. It
Is
is
the
called
sentiment
Far
there
East.
different than it would be in Moscow?
I'm sorry, the internet
Is the
cut out again.
feeling
What?
in the eastern part of Russia, because that's very far away from Moscow. Is it any different out there than it would be like in Moscow?
I wouldn't say it is well, Moscow, in my opinion, we actually, as Russians, as young Russians, we used to say that Moscow is not Russia because Moscow is absolutely different city by the standards of living, by salaries,
Mm.
by pensions, by everything. It's like a really big European comfortable city by all standards. All Americans say that, but the rest of Russia is way different, way different. And let's compare some, Western region as like, Vladimirskaya Oblast, like the Vladimir region, and the far east of Russia, like my Khabarovsk territory. I wouldn't say it should be different because, most of the young and protestive people who are supposed to be more protestive than others, they just go to Moscow for a better quality of life, as I did when I was 17 and entered the university. So some people say that the far east of Russia is more protective because it's so far from Moscow, 7,000 kilometers away, and we don't really feel this bond to Moscow, the capital of Russia, and also what kind of shows that it's more protective in 2019 no in 2020 there were huge protests in Khabarovsk regions about Sergei Furgal, who was the governor of Khabarovsk territory, and he was more popular in Khabarovsk territory than Putin. And there was a leaked video when somebody from the administration of president came to Sergei Furgal and his administration in Khabarovsk, and they said, how so the governor is being more popular in Russia than the president. So after that, they just, they jailed him and he's still in prison.
Wow.
And
Wow.
after that, so many people went out to the streets of Khabarovsk. There were like maybe 20,000 people in Khabarovsk going to the protests. And some of the protests lasted for 100 days. Every day people were going out to the streets. Even policemen were supporting this protest. They didn't really stop anyone. But then, another governor was sent from Moscow to Khabarovsk, Degtyaryov, and he started to to fight the protest really really bad, and well, he succeeded in the end.
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe some people would say that, and I remember I was watching those protests and I participated myself, and I was watching like live chat from a translation from the protest, and people from all over Russia, they were saying, oh yeah, Moscow with us, like Novgorod with us, we're supporting that, we're supporting your fight for the for your governor, for your freedom in a way.
Now that you've
Uh,
been in Georgia for several months, what has been the most difficult thing about moving to Georgia?
well, I'd say just, leaving your homeland at the age of 20 is always supposed to be hard. So this kind of, you know, the kind of like the age I'm leaving Russia, it was pretty hard for me because many of the things I'm not used to, do myself, and I gotta learn to live by myself. I mean, I used to live in a dorm in Moscow, and I went to the US for like half a year. But when I was living in a dorm, it was Russia still was, way easier for me. And in the US, I was living in the host family, so everything was kind of prepared for me and done for me. But here I gotta settle up life by myself, find an apartment myself, find everything I need myself to settle up my life. I wouldn't say it is too different because Georgia is still a post-Soviet country, as and many things are. Let's say they just similar to Russia. Um, I would say that it's kind of like the emotional level of just in emotions that you feel when you're being in a country that is occupied by your country. And all the time I go to public places, I'm always trying to speak English because I'm just ashamed of speaking Russian sometimes. But once people hear my Russian accent, they're gonna be like, oh, we can switch to Russian if you want to. So still there is this pressure. I remember I went to Turkey in June just to visit my friends who also fled not mobilization, but the war in March. And in Turkey, I felt like, okay, like there is literally, it feels like there is no war. And people who go to Turkey, I think they are trying to isolate from the news, from the war, from this pressure, which you get in Georgia. And I just, it feels, this pressure feels in Georgia. And of course, it's really hard not to remember about the war in Georgia. I'm not trying to avoid it, but many of the Russians, I think they just want to
They
like,
would
okay,
rather
I just
not.
want to forget.
Yeah, yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, they just want to leave Russia forever. Many of them, not myself though. So yeah, there are quite few hard things about being in Georgia as Russian, but it's just nothing comparing to what happens in Ukraine in the war
Well, it
basically.
sounds like
Yeah.
you've got a close circle of friends and people that you can that are going through the same thing you are, that you can all help each other, and that's a big deal. That's one of the biggest reasons that I enjoy going to church. I mean, other than the spiritual aspects of church, church is a guaranteed place where you have family, and so wherever I go in the world, when I go to church, I'm with my family, and there's a group of people there whose specific purpose is to help each other and to love each other and to provide that companionship. And when I get lonely, especially here in Ukraine, after months and months away from my family, I go to church on Sunday and I feel like I'm at home. So that's very important. That community, that sense of belonging is super important, and I'm glad that you found something like that. Um, how can people get in touch with you or watch your stuff or anything like that to come support you as you do your thing online?
Yeah, sure. My channel is called Zack the Russian, Zack with a CK, not CH. I also have my Gmail. It is in the description of the video on my YouTube channel. I mean, and also have an Instagram, just Zack the Russian. You can type it and you can just DM me. I'm not a huge YouTuber, so I mostly answer most of the DMs. So yeah, feel free.
Awesome. Good. Well, thank you for spending some time with us today. It's fascinating to get a chance to talk to you. This is what they call first source journalism right here, talking to the people that are experiencing it on the ground. And this is the kind of thing that is very difficult to get through the mainstream media anymore. So I really enjoy getting a chance to interface with people around the world. Isn't it amazing to think, here's this kid from the eastern part of Russia that's gone to Georgia. Here's this guy that lives in Panama that's stuck in Ukraine, for the last 6 months, and we can have meaningful conversations because of this technology. I just love it. It's awesome. Thanks again.
Yeah, me too. Me too, Chuck.
We'll
Yeah,
be
thank you
praying
so
for
much for
you.
having me. Yeah, thank you for having me on your channel.
All right.
Sure, sure. See
Okay.
ya. Thank you so much.